During the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers believed distance protected them. They were wrong. On remote island ridgelines, U.S. Marines discovered that a weapon built for suppression could be turned into a precision killer one round at a time. If you follow this story, you'll understand the overlooked mistake that made entire Japanese positions vulnerable, and why a single infantry adaptation quietly changed the balance of the fight. During the Pacific War, distance was more than space. It was doctrine. Across island battlefields like Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Okinawa, Japanese forces relied on a simple, deeply ingrained belief: American infantry weapons had limits, and beyond those limits, positions were safe. Ridges, cave mouths, and observation posts were chosen with distance in mind. If a position sat far enough beyond effective rifle range, it could be held with confidence. Snipers could observe. Machine gun crews could fire. Forward observers could operate in daylight. They were not careless. They were following the rules of modern infantry combat as every army understood them. American rifle fire was dangerous up close. Machine guns were dangerous when they swept terrain. Artillery was dangerous everywhere. But beyond a certain distance, infantry weapons stopped mattering. That assumption shaped the battlefield. Japanese positions on elevated ridgelines dominated the terrain below. From caves carved into coral and volcanic rock, defenders watched Marine units advance through open ground and jungle approaches. They fired selectively, then withdrew, confident that return fire could not reach them with accuracy. Marine riflemen felt the cost of that confidence. Patrols slowed. Movement became cautious. Casualties mounted not from overwhelming attacks, but from isolated, deliberate shots fired from positions no one could easily answer. The distance was not extreme by artillery standards, but for infantry weapons, it might as well have been untouchable. That was the logic. American doctrine reinforced it. Rifles were precision tools. Machine guns were suppression weapons. Heavy machine guns, especially, were never meant to be subtle. They fired in bursts. They controlled space. They forced heads down so infantry could maneuver. No manual described them as tools for engaging individual soldiers at extreme range. Accuracy belonged to the rifleman. Volume belonged to the machine gun crew. That division was treated as fixed. Yet on several Pacific islands, Marine heavy weapons teams found themselves confronting a problem doctrine could not solve. Enemy snipers operated from ranges riflemen could not reach. Artillery support was not always available, and repeated bombardment was often impractical against hardened cave systems. The battlefield demanded a response from infantry units themselves. That response did not begin with a new weapon. It began with a question. The Browning M2 .50 caliber machine gun was already present on these battlefields. It was heavy, powerful, and reliable, designed to destroy vehicles, aircraft, and massed formations. On paper, its effective range extended far beyond that of standard infantry rifles. In practice, no one tried to use it precisely, not because it couldn't reach that far, but because no one had been trained to make it do so. Some Marine crews began to look at the weapon differently, mounted on a stable tripod, anchored behind sandbags and coral, fired deliberately instead of continuously. They noticed something the manuals never emphasized. Mass created stability. Stability allowed control, and control, if paired with patience, could produce accuracy. Not by chance, not by luck, but by intention. The idea was simple, almost uncomfortable in its implications. If a machine gun could be fired one round at a time, if its recoil could be absorbed, if its trajectory could be calculated, then distance stopped being a shield. It became a variable. The first shots did not announce a revolution. They were not decisive kills. They did not immediately collapse enemy defenses. What they did instead was far more dangerous. They forced the enemy to realize that a line they trusted no longer existed, that positions chosen for safety were suddenly exposed, and that the battlefield they thought they understood was changing, quietly, methodically, one round at a time. Once that assumption cracked, Everything built on it became unstable, and the ridge was about to learn how fragile safe distance really was. The idea did not come from a handbook. There was no formal order to change how the weapon was used. No doctrine revision. No new training program. It began at the lowest level, with infantry crews who were already under pressure, already exposed, and already watching men die from positions they could not touch. The Browning M2 had always been part of the battlefield. It was loud, heavy, unforgiving. 84 pounds of steel, mounted on a tripod, designed to absorb recoil from sustained fire. Its purpose was simple: dominate terrain through volume. But volume was not solving this problem. Enemy snipers were not advancing in formations. They were appearing briefly, firing once or twice, then disappearing into caves or foliage. Suppressive fire wasted ammunition. Artillery was slow or unavailable, and rifle fire could not reach. The situation forced a question most soldiers never asked. What if the weapon itself was not the limitation? Marine heavy weapons crews began to slow everything down. Instead of sweeping arcs across ridgelines, they locked the gun in place. Traverse stops were tightened. Elevation was adjusted deliberately, not rapidly. The machine gun stopped moving. It rested. That change alone went against instinct. Machine guns were meant to be alive, constantly shifting, constantly firing. A stationary gun was vulnerable, but a stationary gun was also predictable. And predictability is the foundation of precision. Once the gun stopped behaving like a machine gun, the crew began treating it like something else. Not a rifle, something larger. An instrument that could be aimed, measured, and corrected. At extreme range, accuracy is not about reflex. It is about calculation. Marine crews understood ballistics from experience, even if doctrine rarely demanded it of them. They knew that every projectile followed a curve. That gravity never stopped working. That wind mattered more over distance than power. The .50 caliber round left the barrel at tremendous speed, faster than anything most infantrymen had fired before. At long range, it dropped, but it dropped predictably. The flight time was long enough to observe, long enough to correct. None of this was secret knowledge. What was missing was permission to apply it. Crews began building improvised range references. Landmarks were measured and memorized. Distances were estimated using terrain features and known dimensions. Simple range cards appeared, often nothing more than scribbles on cardboard or paper scraps. This was not artillery science. It was infantry adaptation. One change mattered more than all the others. Single-shot firing. Instead of bursts, the trigger was squeezed once, then released. No spray, no correction through volume. Each round was an experiment. To make that experiment visible, crews mixed tracer rounds into their belts, not randomly, not for intimidation, for information. A tracer every few rounds allowed the gunner to watch the shot's path, to see how far it drifted, to measure the drop. Every tracer told a story, and each story made the next shot more accurate. The first attempts were cautious. No one expected immediate kills. The goal was not destruction. It was confirmation. Could the round reach the target area? Could it land close enough to matter? When the first tracer arced across the valley and struck near an enemy position, the result was immediate. Not blood, confusion. Enemy soldiers froze. Some withdrew abruptly. They had felt the shockwave, heard the impact. They had just been reached by something they believed could not reach them. That moment mattered more than any confirmed kill, because it attacked the assumption. From that point forward, the process became deliberate. Adjust, fire, observe, correct. The machine gun was no longer suppressing, it was interrogating the battlefield. Enemy behavior changed first at the edges. Snipers stayed hidden longer. Observation posts were abandoned more frequently. Movement between positions became rushed, irregular. The Marines noticed, not because of what they hit, but because of what stopped happening. This was not dominance through noise. There was no constant roar of fire. The ridge was quiet, and that quiet was unsettling. Word spread quickly through Marine lines. Not through official channels, through observation. Platoons that had been pinned down for days noticed fewer shots coming in. Routes that had been dangerous at daylight suddenly felt passable. Officers began asking questions. What changed? The answer was uncomfortable. A heavy machine gun, used incorrectly, according to doctrine, was reaching farther than expected. The experiment was no longer theoretical, it was shaping behavior. And behavior, in warfare, is often more important than casualties. Yet the adaptation carried risk. Precision required exposure. To aim, the gunner had to remain in position longer. To observe, the crew had to stay visible. Each shot made the position easier to locate. The machine gun, that had once been ignored as background noise, was becoming a focal point. Success was drawing attention, and attention invites response. By the end of the first days of experimentation, Marine crews understood something critical. They had not found a miracle weapon. They had not made the battlefield safe. They had discovered leverage. Distance was no longer an absolute. It was conditional, and conditions could change. The experiment had worked, but the enemy was watching, and the Ridge was learning how to answer back. Breaking the assumption was only the first step. Holding that advantage would prove far more dangerous, because the moment precision began to matter, the machine gun stopped being ignored and became a target. The first change was not tactical, it was behavioral. On ridgelines that had once shown casual movement, something shifted. Figures appeared less often. When they did, they moved faster short bursts from cover to cover. Cave mouths that had been used as firing positions went dark, not because they were destroyed, but because they no longer felt safe. Japanese units had relied on distance to control tempo. From elevated positions, they dictated when and where contact occurred. They fired when it suited them. They withdrew when it didn't. That rhythm had been dependable. Now it was broken. The precision fire did not need to be frequent. It only needed to be credible. Once a single round demonstrated that the ridge could be reached, every second spent exposed became a risk calculation, and risk changes behavior faster than casualties. Marine units below noticed the difference almost immediately. Patrols that had been halted by intermittent sniper fire began moving again. Supply parties adjusted routes that had been closed for days. The enemy had not disappeared. They had gone quiet. Silence on a battlefield is rarely comforting. It suggests restraint, observation, preparation. But this silence felt different. It felt hesitant. The reason was simple. Japanese forces no longer trusted the distances they had chosen for protection. Positions that had once been selected with confidence were now questionable. Observation posts that once directed fire were abandoned or manned briefly. Even machine gun teams repositioned, seeking deeper cover. The ridge was still held, but it was no longer controlled. Command attention followed. Marine officers began focusing on terrain that had previously been ignored. Ranges once dismissed as irrelevant were now discussed in detail. Binoculars tracked movement patterns instead of muzzle flashes. Reports changed tone. Instead of describing enemy firepower, they described enemy absence. That absence became the real indicator of success. The heavy machine gun was no longer treated as background noise. It became a tool for shaping behavior. Not through saturation, through uncertainty. Enemy units began altering how they moved. Long observation periods were abandoned. Snipers fired fewer shots, then relocated sooner. Positions that required steady exposure were avoided altogether. This was not fear in the emotional sense. It was risk management. From the Japanese perspective, the battlefield had become unpredictable. A weapon they understood and had learned to work around was no longer behaving as expected. The suppression weapon had turned selective, and selectivity is unsettling. The psychological effect rippled outward. One abandoned position forced adjustments elsewhere. Movement patterns shifted across entire sections of the ridge. Units began coordinating movement more tightly, reducing independence. What had once been flexible defense became rigid. Rigid systems break more easily. For the Marines, the effect was subtle but profound. They were not advancing faster because of increased firepower. They were advancing because the enemy hesitated. And hesitation creates opportunity. But the change did not go unnoticed. Enemy observers were learning, not about the machine gun's power, but about its position. Precision fire requires time. Time to observe, time to aim, time to confirm, and time creates patterns. After several days, incoming fire began to change character. It was no longer sporadic. It became deliberate. Shots arrived from angles that suggested planning rather than chance. Mortar rounds landed closer to known firing positions. Not accurately, but intentionally. The implication was clear. The enemy had stopped treating the machine gun as a nuisance. They were treating it as a threat. This marked a turning point. The Marines had succeeded in forcing behavioral change. But success came with exposure. The very qualities that made the precision fire effective, patience, observation, repetition, also made the firing position identifiable. To remain accurate, the gun had to stay in place. And staying in place invited retaliation. The battlefield was adapting again. For the first time since the experiment began, Marine crews faced a familiar problem. They were no longer dictating the engagement. They were reacting. Counter-sniper fire probed the area. Mortar rounds tested likely positions. The enemy did not need to hit the gun. They only needed to force it to move. Because movement would erase the careful measurements that made precision possible. Range cards would become useless. Wind estimates would reset. Stability would be lost. The advantage was fragile. Marine commanders recognized the danger. A fixed position, no matter how effective, could not survive indefinitely once identified. The heavy machine gun had altered the fight. Now it had to survive it. The psychological pressure shifted. For days, the enemy had lived with uncertainty. Now the machine gun crew did. Every adjustment risked exposure. Every shot invited response. The silence that once belonged to the ridge now belonged to the Marines. By the end of this phase, one truth was clear. The experiment had succeeded beyond expectation, but it had also triggered a second problem. One doctrine had prepared for just as poorly. What happens when the enemy adapts? Breaking the assumption had been easy. Holding the advantage would not be, because the moment precision mattered, the machine gun stopped being ignored and became the most hunted position on the battlefield. The response was measured, not rushed, not emotional. It was systematic. Enemy fire no longer came from random points along the ridge. It arrived from angles that suggested intent. Shots passed close enough to matter, close enough to force movement. The message was clear. The position had been identified. Precision fire had changed the enemy's behavior. Now the enemy was changing its tactics. For days, the machine gun crew had operated with relative freedom. Distance had protected them as much as it had once protected the ridge. That protection was gone. The first rounds struck sandbags and coral fragments near the firing position. Not accurate enough to kill, accurate enough to warn. This was not harassment. It was range finding. The crew understood immediately what that meant. They had stayed in one place too long. Stability had enabled precision, but stability had also created predictability, and predictability is fatal. The problem was not just tactical, it was structural. The machine gun's accuracy depended on preparation, range cards, wind estimates, known landmarks. All of it was tied to a single point in space. Move the gun, and everything reset. Stay, and the enemy would eventually land a hit. This was the dilemma doctrine never addressed. Precision demanded exposure. Survival demanded movement. The solution was deception. A secondary position was built nearby. Sandbags stacked, camouflage netting draped. Even a convincing silhouette where a gunner's head would appear. From a distance, it looked real. It needed to be. The actual machine gun was quietly relocated. Not far, just far enough, into a shallow coral depression that offered protection from the most dangerous angles while preserving fields of fire toward the ridge. The move took time. Time under observation. Every range reference had to be recalculated. Every landmark reassessed. The precision advantage was fragile. It could be lost in minutes. When firing resumed, it was different. Slower, more cautious. Shots were taken only when the value justified the risk. The machine gun no longer spoke freely. The enemy tested the decoy. Rounds struck the false position. Mortar fragments shredded netting. The real gun stayed silent, watching, learning. This was no longer about proving a concept. It was about survival. The engagement had become symmetrical. Both sides now possessed precision. Both sides understood exposure. The battlefield had evolved into a duel of patience and perception. For the Marines, this was unfamiliar territory. Machine gun crews were trained to dominate space, not evade detection. Now they were doing both. The enemy adapted again. Counter-snipers began working methodically. They did not fire often. They waited. They searched for movement patterns, heat shimmer, disturbed foliage, anything that betrayed a firing position. The machine gun crew felt the pressure immediately. Every adjustment carried risk. Every observation required exposure. The act of aiming became dangerous. The advantage that had once reshaped the battlefield now demanded constant vigilance. Precision fire was no longer a tool. It was a liability if misused. The Marines compensated by narrowing their focus. Only the most critical targets were engaged. Observation posts directing fire, machine gun crews threatening supply routes, snipers pinning infantry. Everything else was ignored. This selectivity had consequences. Enemy units sensed the reduction in fire. Movement increased again tentatively at first, then with more confidence. The ridge was probing for weakness. The Marines had traded one problem for another. They had removed the enemy's comfort, but they had not removed the enemy. And then a new constraint appeared. One doctrine could not adapt fast enough to solve. Ammunition. Precision fire consumed fewer rounds, but it demanded perfect timing, and resupply was no longer reliable. The machine gun crew counted belts, then counted individual rounds. Numbers that once felt abstract became immediate. Each shot now reduced future options. The enemy did not need to destroy the gun. They only needed to wait. The battlefield was tightening. Time, exposure, and logistics were closing in at once. The experiment had reached its most dangerous phase. Precision had broken the enemy's confidence. Now scarcity threatened to break the precision itself. And with ammunition running low, the next decision would not be about accuracy, but about what was worth shooting at all. Scarcity changes everything, not gradually, immediately. For days, precision had reshaped the battlefield. Now, numbers threatened to undo it. Belts that once arrived on schedule did not come. Beach supply routes were disrupted. Landing zones came under fire. The heavy machine gun was still operational, but the flow that sustained it was gone. The crew began counting ammunition differently, not by belts, by rounds. Every cartridge represented reach. Every shot removed a future option. What had once been a technical problem became a strategic one. The enemy sensed the shift. Movement on the ridge increased not recklessly, but deliberately. Observation posts reappeared. Machine gun teams tested old positions. They were probing, not to attack, to measure. The Marines faced an uncomfortable truth. Precision fire worked because it was credible, but credibility required presence, and presence required ammunition. Doctrine offered no guidance here. Machine guns were not meant to ration shots. They were meant to dominate through volume. Now volume was impossible, and restraint carried risk. The crew began prioritizing. Targets were ranked, not by visibility, by consequence. An observation post that directed mortar fire mattered more than a lone rifleman. A machine gun crew threatening a supply route mattered more than sporadic movement. Some targets were deliberately ignored, not because they were harmless, but because they were not decisive. This restraint felt wrong. Every infantry instinct argued for engagement, but discipline demanded otherwise. Precision had to become selective. The enemy adjusted again. Once they realized the fire had narrowed, they exploited it. Small units advanced cautiously into areas that had been silent for days. They established temporary firing points. They withdrew before return fire could be justified. The ridge was learning how to operate inside the gaps. The pressure intensified. Marine infantry units reported increased harassment. Supply movements slowed again. Casualties ticked upward. The heavy machine gun could solve these problems, but only if it fired. The crew faced a decision no manual had prepared them for. Fire now and risk having nothing later. Hold fire and accept immediate losses. Command involvement increased. Officers did not order more shooting. They asked harder questions. What targets mattered most? Where did fire change behavior rather than just cause damage? The answers were not obvious. The solution did not come from firepower. It came from coordination. Other heavy weapons crews were facing the same problem. Each had limited ammunition. Each had isolated firing positions. Each was making the same calculations alone. That isolation was inefficient. The decision was made to pool resources. Ammunition was consolidated. Information was shared. Targets were prioritized collectively. Precision fire stopped being an individual effort. It became a network. This changed everything. Instead of multiple guns firing sporadically, a single gun engaged at a time, supported by observation from others. Information moved faster than bullets. When the enemy moved, they were watched. When they exposed themselves, the most prepared gun fired. Not often, but decisively. The ridge reacted violently. Movement slowed again. Positions were abandoned more quickly. The enemy had expected the precision fire to fade. Instead, it became sharper, but the cost was high. The pooled ammunition supply was finite. Every successful engagement reduced the total. There would be no resupply before it was exhausted. The enemy chose that moment to escalate. Probing attacks intensified. Small units tested marine lines after dark. Machine guns attempted to interdict supply routes. This was no longer passive adaptation. It was pressure. The Marines responded surgically. Single shots eliminated machine gun crews, threatening key routes. Observers directing fire disappeared. Each engagement was planned, each round justified. This was not dominance, it was survival. The psychological effect returned. Japanese units hesitated again, not because fire was constant, but because it was unpredictable. They could not tell when a position would be engaged, only that some positions were fatal. The ridge became cautious. Movement shifted to night. Daylight activity dropped sharply. The battlefield slowed. The ammunition count continued to fall. Numbers that once seemed theoretical became unavoidable. The crew knew the end was approaching. Either the enemy would break, or the gun would fall silent. The final engagements were the most difficult. Targets appeared that were dangerous but not critical. Firing at them would feel right. But feel did not matter. Only outcome. The crew held fire longer than instinct allowed. They waited for positions that would shape the fight. When they fired, it was with intent to change behavior, not score hits. The enemy misread the restraint. They assumed weakness. They assumed the precision fire had run its course. That assumption cost them. A coordinated enemy push collapsed after a handful of carefully chosen shots. Machine gun teams fell silent. Leaders disappeared. The momentum died. The ammunition pool was nearly exhausted. But the battlefield had shifted again. Not permanently. Just enough. By the time resupply finally reached the Marines, the ridge had already changed its posture. Japanese units no longer operated with confidence at range. Positions were deeper. Movement more cautious. The advantage had not been sustained indefinitely, but it had been sustained long enough. The experiment had reached its limit, not because it failed, but because war imposes ceilings no adaptation can ignore. Precision had survived scarcity, but it had done so by narrowing its purpose. The final question was no longer whether the method worked, but what it had permanently changed. The fighting did not end with a dramatic breakthrough. There was no single moment where the ridge collapsed all at once. No decisive charge. No overwhelming barrage. What followed was quieter and more revealing. Japanese positions did not disappear overnight. They receded. Movement became cautious. Exposure brief. Daylight activity, rare. Units that had once relied on distance to dominate the battlefield now behaved as if every meter mattered, not because they were defeated, but because certainty was gone. The heavy machine gun had not destroyed the ridge, it had destroyed an assumption. As Marine units advanced and cleared former enemy positions, the pattern became obvious. Caves were deeper, observation posts were abandoned or relocated. Fields of fire that once overlooked open ground were left unused. The enemy had not lost ground because they were overpowered. They had lost it because they no longer trusted it. Reports filtered upward, not heroic accounts, technical ones. Range estimates, ammunition usage, behavioral changes. The emphasis was not on kills, it was on effect. Commanders noted something unusual. The precision machine gun fire had achieved results disproportionate to the number of rounds fired. Casualties alone could not explain it. Behavior could. The method spread quietly, not through doctrine manuals, not through official training programs, through observation. Other crews began experimenting. Some succeeded, some failed, but the idea took hold. A suppression weapon could be selective. A tool meant for volume could be precise. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to matter. The lesson was not about the Browning M2. It was about understanding capability. Weapons did not define their own limits. Assumptions did. For decades, armies had separated precision and firepower into different categories. Rifles were accurate, machine guns were not. That division simplified training. It also created blind spots. On Pacific Islands, those blind spots had been exposed by necessity, not innovation labs, not research divisions, infantry crews under pressure. The adaptation did not replace doctrine, it revealed its edges. Precision fire with heavy machine guns was never meant to become universal. It required conditions, stability, time, ammunition discipline, coordination. Remove any one of those, and the method collapsed. But when those conditions existed, the effect was undeniable. Distance stopped being protection, and protection is often what allows a system to function. The Japanese response confirmed the lesson. They did not attempt to counter the machine gun by matching it. They adjusted behavior. They hit more, moved less, abandoned positions earlier. Their entire defensive posture shifted, not because of firepower, but because of uncertainty. Uncertainty is corrosive. It spreads. It slows decision-making, restricts initiative. In warfare, that matters more than statistics. By the end of the campaign, the battlefield no longer resembled the one the enemy had prepared for. The ridge still existed, but it no longer controlled the fight. The heavy machine gun returned to its traditional role as the Marines advanced. The experiment ended not with failure, but with irrelevance. The conditions that made precision possible faded as the fight moved forward. That was expected. What remained was the insight. In war, systems break not when equipment fails, but when assumptions go untested. The most dangerous limits are the ones no one questions. On those Pacific ridgelines, one infantry adaptation forced an entire defensive system to reconsider what safety meant, not through overwhelming force, through understanding. That lesson did not belong to a single crew. It belonged to anyone willing to look at familiar tools and ask an uncomfortable question. What else could this do? If we stopped using it the way we were told, the battlefield did not change because the machine gun became something new. It changed because someone realized it never was what they thought it was.